This week, we welcome Damon Small, Technical Director of Security Consulting at NCC Group, for an interview covering the Florida water treatment facility hack and the convergence of OT and IT. Next up, Artie Holub, Senior Security Analyst, and Austin McBride, Data Scientist, both from Cisco Umbrella, join us to talk about some chart-topping threats and how attacks will rage in 2021. In the security news, XM Cyber announces integration with Palo Alto Networks' Cortex XSOAR API. Security lessons learned. Cycode raises $20 million. Help Systems acquires Beyond Security. Accurix Terrascan integrates with the Argo project. Sequent Security API Sentinel 2.0. SecLore Security 24 protects sensitive data. Who's really behind the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack? ForcePoint acquires Cyber Inc. Sophos launches the industry-only XDR solution for endpoint server firewall and email security. And all that and more. Stay tuned on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly.
Hey IT and security pros, if you remember one thing from today's episode, it should be to check out the leading cloud directory platform, JumpCloud. JumpCloud's directory platform makes it easier to solve today's IT challenges by unifying device and user management through a single pane of glass. With JumpCloud securely managing your users and their devices, doing common things like onboarding and offboarding remote workers is easy. Try JumpCloud for free today at securityweekly.com/JumpCloud and help your organization move to a modern, secure hybrid work model.
MediaOps presents DevOps Connect, May 19th at RSA Conference. Christopher Krebs, former director of the U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, will keynote in a live fireside chat with host Alan Schimmel, which will also include Q&A with the audience. Besides an exciting keynote, you can also attend 30 other sessions featuring a powerhouse lineup of DevSecOps experts. Sign up for this free event now.
Wide-scale adoption of cloud applications, an increase in remote workers, and expansion of branch offices has rendered the centralized, on-premises security model impractical. Enter Cisco Umbrella. Umbrella now includes secure web gateway, firewall, and cloud access security broker functionality, plus integration with Cisco SD-WAN, all delivered from a single cloud security service. It helps businesses of all sizes secure their network and extend protection to roaming users and branch offices. Security doesn't have to be complicated. Get simple, smart, and powerful security with Cisco Umbrella. Visit securityweekly.com/Cisco Umbrella to learn more. Welcome to Enterprise Security Weekly, episode number 227 for May 12th, 2021. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, joined remotely by Adrian Sanabria. Adrian, welcome.
Hey, and welcome to the best pipeline coverage in the business.
That's right. Gotta talk pipelines. Mr. Tyler Shields is here with us as well. Tyler, welcome.
Hey, Paul. Thank you very much. Good to see you again.
Yes. A couple of quick announcements before we dive right into it. If you want to stay in the loop, all things Security Weekly, please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe. You can subscribe via your favorite podcast catcher, our YouTube channel, or sign up for our mailing list, join our Discord server, and follow us on our newest live streaming platform. That's right, we are on Twitch. Also, if you have a specific guest or topic you'd like us to cover on one of the upcoming shows, submit your suggestions for guests at securityweekly.com/guest. Complete that form, and we review those suggestions on a regular basis. Damon Small is the Technical Director of Security Consulting at NCC Group, where he consults with global leaders in critical infrastructure defense. And today he joins us, to talk about pipelines and Florida water treatment attacks. I think we had a new attack that kind of superseded the Florida water attack. We can talk about both, and especially the convergence of OT and IT. Damon, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here, folks. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you here. I guess we were talking about the pipeline attack, of course, at the before we started recording. So I guess we jump right into that because I find it interesting. In of course the memes resulting in what people are calling the gas shortage, and just people post ridiculous things. I'm like, you really they just do no research. Well, I guess the Russians do research before they create the propaganda, right? That's what I feel like is happening.
Yeah.
Is there's a lot of propaganda. Damon, what in your opinion, what's happening with the pipeline attack?
Yeah, well, if you're talking about the propaganda specifically, I mean, one immediate effect has been the shortages. I woke up to the news this morning, and there's already lines of cars trying to gas up their vehicles. So is there really a shortage, or is this exacerbated by panic? Like we had a run on toilet paper when COVID was new and exciting. But I mean, clearly this attack is real. The Colonial Pipeline is actually inoperable right now, and an attack has in fact happened. So that much we know for sure. Now, as we continue discussing this and thinking about what we do moving forward, the conversations will continue to get interesting, I think.
For sure. Yeah, and go ahead, Adrian. I know you researched
Just say, are we totally sure it's not a conspiracy by Tesla?
There's
some Tesla owners feeling pretty superior right now.
And many not being shy about it on social media either.
Probably.
Which is interesting. I find it interesting too, this attack being ransomware, and we delved kind of into it a little bit. It doesn't appear that the intention was to have this consequence necessarily, at least from the evidence that I've seen. I think FireEye had a pretty good post on the technical breakdown. And I think that from what I've read too, the computers that actually operate the pipeline were shut down as a precaution to make sure they didn't get ransomware. So hopefully they can clean it up and we don't have to talk about this particular incident, although it is a good, I think, starting point. Damon, talk about the interesting relationship between OT and IT. How do you see that relationship playing out today?
Yeah, and we've been having in our industry, we've been having this conversation about that convergence of OT and IT for a long time, and I think this just puts a really fine point on it, which is that in the 20 or so years ago, when you had an air gap, for example, OT was protected by virtue of the fact that it didn't communicate outside of the four walls, so to speak, of the facility. So we've known for a long time that there's good reasons to have these interconnects between OT and IT, but this, like I said, underscores the risk that is involved and how much more difficult it is to protect, because you don't have to hop over the fence anymore to gain access to those systems. It can, happen from across the open internet. And I think you're right in your earlier comment. I don't know that the adversary in this case knew who they were attacking. And they came, DarkSide themselves came out with a statement that said, look, we're just in this for the money. Right. We didn't mean to disrupt an entire society. So I don't have any reason to not believe them. I think they're, a lot of times the bad guys are opportunistic. They found a network they could access, and it was probably after the fact that they realized, oh dear, this is, a very significant pipeline in the United States.
And I think there's a lot of reasons why it's interesting, Dim, because you kind of hint towards that critical infrastructure tends to be a little more vulnerable in terms of, their exposures, because, upgrading and maintaining those computers is still, it's tricky business. It's not just upgrading someone's laptop where if it blows up, ship them a new laptop and they can use their home computer for a little while. I mean, we call it critical infrastructure for a reason.
It's critical infrastructure, and it has to be operational all the time. I mean, a lot of us that are working, in the industrial control system space got our start in IT, myself included. So back in the 90s, I was a sysadmin, and most traditional businesses, your users go home at the end of the day. In worst case scenario, you've got a lengthy outage window every single night. You don't have that in the factory or the refinery or the pipeline company. You don't have those outages. They're expected to be up and running, 100% of the time for months at a time, 18, 24 months at a time. So those outages to perform these necessary upgrades are few and far between, and they're very costly. I mean, dude, can you imagine how much money, how much revenue will have been lost, not only from Colonial Pipeline, but for everybody that's involved in the energy sector in this country? I mean, there's a lot of money at stake here. And also the critical nature of these devices that support the control systems, they're often purpose built. And, you don't go to a big box store and, buy a PLC off the shelf. Sometimes the operating systems and the firmware and the software that runs on these things is highly specialized and might be beyond the scope of support by a traditional IT staff. So it's a problem that's complicated in many, many ways.
I mean, it's interesting too when we think about that these systems have to be up all the time. Mm-hmm. If I were to be challenged with that, like here in the studio, I'd be like, well, I need remote access so I can make sure it's running all the time. And I think that's how we get ourselves in these situations, such as the Florida water treatment plant.
Well, exactly. And it's interesting you bring up Florida, because that was the attack vector was, I think it was TeamViewer, mm-hmm. remote access software. And it's easy to jump on the bandwagon of demonizing the remote access software. But even though, as an information security professional, I make my living, trying to dissuade or trying to reduce risk to the extent possible. But I would caution everybody listening today that businesses don't tend to make decisions like this lightly. And there's the alternative to remote access is having on-site support mm-hmm. all the time. And that gets costly. Or if you don't have on-site support, like, I have a client that operates, drilling rigs offshore. And if you have to get someone out there, you've got to spin the main rotor on a Bell 206 at great expense. So there's good reasons to have remote access. Mm-hmm. But before everyone gets out their pitchforks, it can be done in a way that is secure. In the case of the Florida water treatment facility, don't have those sorts of devices directly exposed to the internet. Use a VPN maybe, and my goodness, use strong authentication, multi-factor authentication. That could have prevented that attack in Florida.
It seems like the Florida attack was from what I studied about this attack that was made public, it was more of a casual attack. It seemed to me like it was hacking like in the 90s, like someone just stumbled across the system and was like, wow, that's kind of cool. Like, look what I can do. Like, that was kind of neat, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, though, because the adversary had access to the system for, 4 minutes? It wasn't a very long period of time. And also, I'm going off of information I heard just like y'all did. So if anybody heard a different story, please let me know. But apparently the adversary knew exactly what changes to make within the water treatment software that had been gained access to. So that suggests that it was somebody that knew what they were doing and maybe a little more targeted than just, high-tech vandalism. And that's the only thing that spooks me out is that, they immediately started changing the amount of lye that was going into the treated water, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of angry ex-coworkers out there. If you look back through breaches, some of these that on the surface might look like, terrorism or state sponsored or something like that, sometimes end up being, somebody that was fired and they failed to remove all their access before they left.
100%. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of ways that credentials can be stolen, but I agree with you. I mean, that seems to be the most likely scenario, doesn't it? That it was somebody that no longer worked there and their offboarding processes didn't work.
Yeah. Because I think if you are an attacker and you're going after those systems, not to say it's, hackers have this kind of knack for going and learning something completely new and becoming enough of an expert to achieve a goal. If you're going to go through all of that, I don't think the attack would have played out the way that it did, right? I think it's more likely that it's a disgruntled ex-employee and they knew how to log in and go change this thing without having to do a whole bunch of research and figure out how to be stealthy about it, right? That's what we tend to associate, at least I do, with more nation-state style attacks.
No, absolutely. And I tell my clients all the time, I mean, don't worry about the adversary that you catch because they were careless or noisy or whatever. I mean, the really good adversary will not let you know that they're there. Now, how many years ago was it that the store, the retail chain Target became a target? And if I recall correctly, we didn't plan on talking about this, but I believe the bad guys were in Target's network for several months before they were caught. So, I mean, that proves the point.
It was a couple weeks. Yeah, in 2013. Yeah, it was almost a month, I think. And it was right before Black Friday, if I recall.
Okay. I believe you. My point is they were there for a while, whereas in Florida, the adversary was there for minutes. Not days or weeks. But I mean, it still spooks you, right? I mean, if just a casual, just let's say it was a disgruntled former employee was able to cause that much panic, imagine an actual concerted attack by someone that really wanted to wreak havoc. The threat is real. The threat is real.
Yeah, it seems to me there's two solutions that have to be implemented, right? One that you've already kind of talked about, Damon, is process. Making sure that when you offboard employees that you rotate credentials. There's not really a hard cost to doing a lot of these good practices and implementing policies and procedures that lead to a better security posture. Are there efforts to improve these across the board? Because as I've heard too, people who are in the government, Congressman Langevin, and in the White House briefing, they both mentioned that critical infrastructure is largely, if not all, run by privately held companies that do have the power to implement these, but the government isn't necessarily forcing them to implement a policy or procedure. There are guidance, right? What can we do to improve the processes, I guess?
Yeah, it's interesting because as a computer scientist and technologist, it's easy to fall in love with the technology. And let's face it, policy and procedure is not fun. It's not sexy. It's not why most of us got in this industry to begin with. But you're right. I mean, it's the policy and procedure that dictates how humans behave when they're interacting with technology and what is the expected behavior when they're supporting it. So, I mean, I'm reluctant to suggest regulation as, the solution every time something like this happens. But it could be that a business understands that their information assets are important, but they don't necessarily understand the degree to which they need to be supported in terms of these policies and procedures. And that's where regulation can be helpful because it prescribes behavior to an organization. So the idea of, self-policing, so to speak, in industry or self-attestation that, trust us, we're secure because we filled out this checklist. I mean, that can only go so far. So I'll stop just short of saying that federal regulation has to get involved in how to do this. But I mean, it already is a completely different part of the Fed space. But if you are a DoD contractor or you otherwise provide goods or services to the DoD, there's a new set of standards and regulations coming called CMMC. Completely different topic, but it's going to be a game changer, and it has the potential to be a big deal for very similar reasons, because organizations don't yet know how to manage their environments in a way that's fit for risk.
And that has the potential, CMMC has the potential to have some teeth, right? Like you won't get a government contract if you're not compliant. You put that in critical infrastructure, like what you can't be finding critical infrastructure companies that are providing water and gas in our infrastructure, right? Like how do you balance that? I never really quite thought of it that way, right?
I know. I mean, you're right. And that's why I said I'm reluctant to suggest regulation as a solution, because if you believe that there's 300,000 service providers that work for the Department of Defense, then if one can't sell the green widget, then somebody else will sell the green widget. Right. But you're right. I mean, this is one pipeline that starts in Houston and ends in New Jersey, I think it is. And now the country is we're freaking out, frankly, because of that one pipeline. So you're right. You put sanctions on that and say, okay, you've been very bad. You have to shut down operations. Imagine if it was the power grid.
Yeah.
Imagine if it was the transmission parts of the network that are moving that power from where it's generated. It's not just the producers, right? I mean, the whole thing. I mean, I'm in Texas, so I know a thing or two about fragile power grids.
Yes.
That taught us that, I mean, we want to be as close to 100% efficiency as possible, which is good from a business standpoint. But what it means is there's very little free space, for lack of a better way to put it. When we have something go down, we don't have extra capacity. We don't have a lot of it anyway.
Tyler?
I'll take it even one step further. You pretty much would have to put regulation in play for this to happen. I know you're reticent to kind of make that leap, but I'll make that leap because I think from an incentive standpoint, there's only so far that these critical infrastructure providing private companies will go before they start to reach into margins too far and they say, hey, that's all I'm going to do. And if it doesn't meet the minimum guidelines or the minimum reality of expectations of what security should be, without enforcement, without fines and regulations and requirements, they won't do it, right? They're just not incented to do so. They have the "it won't hit me" attitude, right? So I think we're going to have to find sanctions and fines and other regulations and requirements on anybody that's providing a critical infrastructure component. And if you can't do it, you don't provide that component. We will build something else as a nation to support that eventually, and that's the only way that we're going to stop these attacks from happening.
I look at it as how I discipline my kids, right? Sometimes it's positive reinforcement, sometimes it's negative reinforcement, and I tend to, like, if you stick with one or the other, like if I'm constantly just blocking their iPads and cutting off their access, or if I'm constantly like buying them some reward, like it's a balance of the two that I find works. And I think this is a very similar scenario where you want to kind of balance both positive and negative reinforcement to get the appropriate behavior that you're looking for.
Right. I mean, you can't find, organizations that have nothing to pay the fines with. I mean, if you look at some of these, running a water treatment plant is just part of the city budget. It's just a public-private partnership, or part of the city's operations.
Water and electric and power are interesting because there are businesses that encourage you to use less of the product, like use the least amount of the product as possible, right? Whereas look at Microsoft or any other company, like we want to use as much of our, AWS, we want to use as many services as possible, right? When you get into power and water, they're like, no, we want you to conserve and not use as much, which is weird.
But I mean, generally, like a lot of them, their budget is whatever it needs to be to clean up the shards of whatever broke on the floor and replace it, and that's it.
Yep.
Sorry, if something physical hasn't shattered, and if there's not a leak somewhere, then they're not doing anything with it.
And do we have to change that as a nation and all pay a little bit more for our utilities, our gas, our electric, our power to ensure that it's safe? Is that the right way to solve it?
I'm not sure that's even an option. I mean, you're looking at and so one of the interesting things here, we actually had a talk on this at B-Sides Knoxville. We had a couple lawyers talking about this, and they shone, a bit of a light on the organizations that run these things. And there is budget. There is federal money and like interest-free loans that are available that a lot of these organizations just don't even know about. And I think the conclusion we came to is there's going to have to be some community level involvement here, to get us across the finish line. Maybe some cybersecurity folks, maybe some concerned citizens, are going to have to step in and help out. And I think that might be the only way we get there.
I wonder if part of the problem is that, funding is available. You're right. And if it's not being used, is it that the businesses don't recognize the need, or they think that, they're talking about everybody else, I've got my stuff together. I understand how to protect my information assets. Because it's basic, like budgeting, right? Each of us has a home budget, and you never want to pay more to protect something than what it would cost to replace that thing. right? Well, that's the problem. Do we really understand how much our information assets are worth until something bad like this happens? So I kind of feel like, again, it's not the technological part of the problem, but I still can't shake this feeling that we're not really good at evaluating information assets. And until we can quantify that in a more meaningful way than we do today, then it's difficult to answer the question, how much money should we spend to protect it, right? That's what it comes down to. And I don't know the answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's an interesting formula on how you mitigate operational risk and reduce your technical debt in critical infrastructure systems. Because it's hard if something's working and it's running, right? It's hard to justify improvements.
Well, and it's difficult. I can't tell you how many times I've said this, because something bad didn't happen yesterday doesn't have any bearing on the likelihood of something bad happening tomorrow. In other words, probability is not cumulative. So I think a lot of us, particularly operators that have been up and running for a very long time, it's easy to become complacent and say, man, we haven't had an incident in a very, very long time, so we must be doing something right?
Perfect track record.
Yeah.
Until it isn't, right? As a, my pen testing days, I can't tell you how many times I heard that. Well, nothing bad's happened yet, and we used to joke that we needed to provide breach as a service, because that's the only way some of these organizations were going to, spend any money on it, was if something bad actually happened, then they'll go fix it. So again, it's back in that, we'd rather not think about it unless, water's spurting out, and there's a broken, pipe on Main Street or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the best time to buy a plunger is before you need it. Right. I mean, and so, probability is not cumulative. We can't predict these things. And I don't know. It's not just the technology, even though, this is the third time I've said it. The technology is the sexy part, is the interesting part. But we've got, for us to have credibility as computer nerds and have a seat at the boardroom table, so to speak, we've got to get better at communicating with the business. I think we're not going to expect the business to become computer scientists overnight. So maybe that's our homework, is we've got to learn to speak their language.
I think one of the common grounds you might have is deeming it as maintenance, because in my experience with critical infrastructure and industrial control systems, there is maintenance that happens all of the time. It sounds like a push to have security be part of that ongoing maintenance, much like we've done in the kind of DevOps realm. Break things down into smaller parts and incorporate security into the everyday maintenance could be a strategy. I can't be the first one to suggest that, right?
Yeah, and just
to... It sounded cooler when you say it.
Yeah.
Right? I guess so.
I do have some numbers here just to get an idea of the scale. So for water utilities, there are 4,000 urban service providers and 50,000 rural service providers. And generally, where you find the private businesses are in some of the larger, more urban ones. So you've got, you might have one that serves millions of people, and then there's a whole bunch of rural ones out there that serve, a couple thousand, couple hundred people. And it's the privately owned is actually about 12%, and the rest is public, because most of those rural ones are owned by the tiny town, out in the sticks, and it's well provided or something like that. It's just not attractive to a business to own or to run that. But on the electric side, it's 3,745 electric utilities. And in that case, it's interesting. It's actually the bulk of those are public owned, but they serve a smaller population. The smaller number of electric utilities are private owned or investor owned, but they serve the majority of the U.S. population.
Oh, that is interesting. Okay. Well,
so that's the size of the problem, just in terms of number of organizations that would have to, comply with something like that?
Well, and that's the thing, is trying to figure out what that is, comply with what. Is it going to be regulation? Is it going to be, another set of standards? I mean, there's so many ways to skin this cat, really. But I one of the questions that keeps coming up, was this just a one-off incident, with the pipeline, or is this a sign of things to come? Can we expect more of this sort of thing to happen? If I could predict that, I wouldn't have to show up for work every day, but I do think that the information security problem and the vulnerabilities that tend to persist in these operational environments isn't going to be solved quickly and not without significant effort, I think.
Well, Damon, we'll have to have you back because we could keep going for a long time. But thank you for appearing on the show today and sharing with our audience and ourselves your thoughts on this matter. And hopefully we get a chance to chat again soon.
I love the sound of my own voice, so anytime. It was great fun chatting with you folks.
Awesome.
I liked it a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Damon. Stick around. We are going to be talking about some upcoming and new threats that are out there for 2021 with the folks from Cisco Umbrella. Stay tuned.